Hello, everybody. It's us. I'm Jason. It's Dan over
Hello.
there. No, there. Yeah, there. Hi. We're here to talk about Apple results. Dan, it's first quarter.
All over again. You thought that first quarter was good? Let's do it again.
Apple made some mistakes in their headlines, and then I repeated one of them in our headline, which is funny.
Oh, you were just following their lead. They must
Yeah,
know what
I
quarter it
was
is, right?
confused. I was bewildered, and then I figured it out and didn't go back and change the headline, unfortunately. So we're here to talk Apple results. They were results. They were there, right?
They were there. They were resulty.
I mean, they made
I mean,
a load of money as they always do, but they're a lot of questions.
my
They well, it was also they were like, oh, they beat the streets guesses, which is true, but the streets guesses were low because they were
very low.
pessimistic, and
It's
Apple did
it's
slightly
always
better than that.
funny. It's always funny when my wife occasionally texts me. She's like, "Oh, I see they beat expectations." So my wife keeps an
Mm-hmm.
ear to the
Nice.
financial news. And I was like, "Yep, but only a little bit." And also, the expectations were low. I beat expectations every day, Jason. I do that by keeping them very low.
Keep them low. That's a classic. It's a classic move, I say. We had the
Which
we also had the analyst call that happened afterward. There's a complete transcript of that at Six Colors. Every time I learn about how much machine learning transcriptions are getting better and better, and also I get to laugh at the things it gets wrong. I had one hallucination loop this time where it just kept saying the same thing over and over again for about 10 sentences. And I was like, well, I guess I'm transcribing this part myself. But it got back. It's so much better than it used to be. It's amazing. So interesting things to be gleaned there
it's
a little
it's
bit.
good that you mentioned that, Jason, because what is the thing we're here to talk about
It's
this quarter?
AI
It's AI.
all the way down.
It's boy, as I joked on Mastodon, if you were drinking every time Tim Cook mentioned AI, you would be very drunk in about 7 minutes because it got mentioned a lot.
A lot.
A lot. Tim is he wants you to know they're working on it and they're very
They're
excited about it.
they're working on it, and in fact, I have. Okay, so I'll give you my little guess here
Hmm.
because Tim said that he at one point in the call specified the two different kinds of AI,
Ah, yes.
which is generative AI and AI. I thought that was interesting because what he
Hmm.
suggested strongly is that next week they're going to show off some generative AI. I think that's interesting because one of my little pet theories about this rumor that they're going to have AI features at the iPad event.
Yeah.
I mean, they might look. There's no rule against it. Everybody's like, oh, but Apple never does that. It's like Apple does what it wants. If Apple decides to do it differently this time,
Yeah.
years of precedence won't stop it. But I did have a pet theory that maybe it will be some specific generative features in iPad apps that'll be done as a beta, and it'll really just be sort of like, and there'll be much more about this at WWDC. It would not surprise me.
Yeah.
But yeah. So he was clear, like stuff is coming, and he
Stuff is
obviously was
coming. Yeah.
trained to say the next few weeks, not
Right.
in
Well, I mean
June,
that
but just the next few
that
weeks.
covers May and June, which is nice, right? So they can be all on top of it. And yeah, I don't know. I find this so interesting because I agree with you. It did not like they built more expectation for this iPad event here, I think, than they have in the press otherwise in some ways. Um, they mentioned a couple times, this is something I kept going back to thinking about that iPad event is they kept like promoting this event as a different kind of event. They said that a couple times in a couple
Yeah.
different places, like it's different. It's like, well, I mean, they're all technically different, but how different is it? And it's like then now listening to this call where they talk so much about AI and product announcements coming makes me feel more intrigued that maybe there are substantive. This isn't merely just like marketing, like, oh, new iPads are different, but that there is some other aspect here. But also, I mean, so much of this is narrative setting, right? I mean, we have heard for the last couple of years about how Apple is behind an AI,
Mm-hmm.
and Tim Cook finds it's very important. And like the number of questions about it have gone up a lot. There were several this time, and so Tim's got to have his little deck of index cards there or whatever with what, like, this is what I'm saying about AI, or what we should say about AI. But like the fact that it was even in the prepared statement, I believe this time around, that to me was interesting.
Oh yeah. I mean, the real tip off was when the MacBook Air came out, and they're like,
Yeah.
best consumer laptop for AI. And
Everyone's like, what?
but yeah, so he said we continue to feel very bullish about our opportunity in generative AI.
Very specific.
We believe in the transformative power and promise of AI and believe we will have advantages that will differentiate us in this new era, including Apple's unique combination of seamless hardware, software, and services and integration, groundbreaking Apple silicon with our industry-leading neural engines and our unwavering focus on privacy. There's the your on device, which underpins everything we create. I mean,
You can
it's
see
right
the
there.
bullet points, right? Like you can see somebody at Apple, marketing or PR sketching out like, here's the beats to
Yeah.
hit. Like this is what we're doing.
Yeah. He's
I thought that
he's
was
improved
interesting.
his stagecraft because there was that one time where he paused and you could literally hear him just turn the page of the thing he was reading. I'm like, don't do that. But yeah, so
He's reading off an
there's
iPad now.
they're harnessing AI. They kept on mentioning it, right? Incredible.
Yeah.
That one that made me laugh was customers are loving the incredible AI performance of the latest MacBook Air and MacBook Pro models. I said, are they loving it? Are they loving it? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. It's AI. I don't know.
Yeah, what are they doing? I don't know.
Because that's,
they're doing AI.
to me, that's the question, right? Is that AI as a buzzword for investors, as a buzzword for people in the tech industry is one thing, but like, are the customers loving it? For the customers to love it, it really needs to be integrated into things that they're doing. And there are some people who are really doing stuff with AI that is not just nonsense, but that's going to be the longer challenge is making it into features that people want to use and that saves people time or does things creatively that they weren't capable of doing before.
Also, the consumer aspect of it is a big question to me because I'm not sure how many people who are really into doing AI stuff are using a MacBook Air and then aren't using cloud-based AI systems, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess there are some people using it as sort of a hobbyist thing. I've done, I played around with whatever the Stable Diffusion version for Mac OS is on my Mac Mini or whatever, but I'm not using it to do anything other than it's novel and I'm playing with it. So yeah. It sounds like a great marketing point, but I'm just also not convinced. I mean, but again, this goes back to narrative. We're talking about setting a narrative, and AI was a big part of that. I don't know if you want to talk about iPhone stuff, iPhone narrative. Big iPhone narrative this time around.
Really, let's so we'll go to the charts and then we will talk about the excuses. I mean, what can you say? There's always truth. There's truth in there, and but there are also like this one was like we're not quite at my dog ate my homework levels, but it was sort of like, hey, I know you told me to bring these 5 things home from the store, but a dog ate one of them. A cat stole another of them. A hippo ran over me and I lost the other 2. But I got this one. It's a little like that where they're like, look, we've got excuses for everything.
Went wild in here. To me, it is, if I may borrow a page from the playbook of soon to be former board member Al Gore, it's a convenient truth that, yes,
sure,
there are some challenges where like things happened. And now we're going to milk that for all that it's worth.
Indeed. Well, as listener Billow just said, to the charts. Off to the charts we go. Okay, I've got Mac
now. This is great.
I've got Mac revenue up now, but let's put a pin in that one and we'll go to the pie chart because the pie chart's good to start. Classic, some little classic pie. Who doesn't love? Come for the pie chart, stay for the bar charts. I always say half iPhone, right? Services, look at that. 26% of revenue to services, which was
when your revenue goes down, right? And services revenue is up. Bigger I can tell you, I do these charts for my own job. And sometimes it's fun to watch big sections of them like jump up and you're like, yeah, but also I got paid less. Like I made less money, but that's the chart is bigger.
Yeah, you can't eat percentages. They don't ask you for a percentage down at the grocery store.
Pie, not tasty.
All right. So here's the big top line: total Apple revenue number and $90.8 billion in revenue. You can look at the year-over-year thing, and what you will see is that it's flat, and it's been flat. This last few quarters is largely a replay of the previous few quarters, and on the positive side, that means it hasn't gone down. The negative side is if you're a Wall Street type and you're looking for growth, there isn't a lot of it, and that is one of the stories. But still, let us not get too bored by a $90.8 billion quarter. That's a lot of money. A lot of money. And then the profit number, also worth pointing out. There was a classic moment today where one of the analysts on the call said, hey, about this cash neutral position thing that you've been saying for years that you were going to do, and you increased your stock buyback. You took it from 90 billion to 110 billion.
The largest stock buyback ever, I think.
And that this is going to be what they're doing from now on, which is great for, investors, because it increases the value of the individual shares of the stock because they're buying it back. And so they're essentially returning money between that and the dividend to the investors instead of putting it into their business, because they're rolling in dough, essentially, right? So they say all of that. The question is sort of like, what happens when you become cash neutral? What then? CFO Luca Maestri, what then? And he said, okay, first off, slow your roll. And the way he said it was very funny. He was very much like, we've been doing this for years and we're still not there. And we just increased our buybacks even more and we're still not there. It's very much, look at this chart. Look at this chart. They can't give the profits away fast enough, right? Like literally they're like, no, we want to be cash neutral. We want the investors to be happy. We're going to get there. And yet, it's that I'm trying to unload all this cash, but I'm strapped to a machine that is shooting out cash. And that is Apple's business right now.
I believe is that not a Taskmaster challenge at some
Sure.
Feels like it.
Sure. I mean, it's like Lucy and the conveyor belt. It's just except for billions and billions of dollars. Yeah. Anyway, that is, again, as people who are not investors in Apple, I'll just say, let us not forget the enormous amounts of profit that this company
Boy, is that a problem I'd love to have.
Mm-hmm. Same. And here's a year-over-year total revenue change just to see the flatness that has happened of late. There was a big growth quarter, or at least an upper one-digit growth quarter in Q4 of 22. But since then, it's been flat, slightly down, slightly up, and this was a 4% down total revenue change. And Apple has lots of excuses for this, and they will tell you that a huge portion, with 60% of their business is outside the U.S., and they report everything in U.S. dollars, and the dollar is, people in the U.S. especially don't notice this, but the dollar is incredibly strong compared to the rest of the world, and it really does harm that part of their business and discounts it. That's all true. It is also an excuse, but it is also true.
It is also, I mean, you look at the trends of the graph, right? And to give them a little bit of credence in their story, it is hard to compare, when you have those astronomical levels of growth, back in 2021 in the pandemic era. We know all the reasons for that, but you look at that chart and 54% growth, right? Like, it's just unless you can't keep up that rate. That rate is so high.
It's growth.
So yeah,
it raises that bar, and then you'd have to do it again instead of just maintaining it, which is more or less what they've done, is kind of maintain it. If we go back to that revenues, I mean, they have gone up to this high level, and they're not coming. They're down a little bit, but they're kind of not back to where they were before they reached that peak. So they've maintained it more or less.
Yeah, which is not a bad thing. But I mean, again, Wall Street demands growth. And if that's the only metric you're using, then it looks like a failure. Whereas the rest of us would say, boy, $90 billion.
That's a lot of money.
Seems great.
It's a lot of money. So I mean, this is why they provide shareholder value in other ways, like dividends and stock buybacks. It's another way they do it. All right, let's look at the Mac.
The Mac did okay.
Yeah, the Mac did okay. Sure. Again,
one of the only segments up.
There was that you can see the big bump, and this is the COVID bump where people bought a lot of Mac hardware, and the Apple Silicon bump too. I think it's both, and it's returned down to a level that's more like it was in 2020. But if we look at the year-over-year change here, what you'll see is that it was up 4%. Apple said that this was primarily due to the new MacBook Air, especially, which has AI features that people are loving. But it is, after coming up the 1% before, it is a small but sort of stabilization after, there was a year there where Mac sales kind of had to go down in the sense that they were not sustainable at the level that they had been before. And so that's what happened. but it's
But
they're
4% up. I
around
mean, in a quarter where everything else was down, those MacBook Airs
in a
gave a nice bump.
quarter
In a quarter
where
where
everything
everything else
else
was
was
down.
down.
Yeah. So
This
good for the Mac. I
was
always root
up.
for the Mac, and I'm always glad to see the Mac doing good
Yep.
business.
Yep. All right. iPad. Ha ha ha. The worst iPad quarter in 4
How could that
years.
be? Why do you think that might be the
And
case?
well, I mean, in that they have not shipped a new iPad in
Could be
5
that.
quarters, it might be that. And you're like, yeah, hey Apple, what are you going to do about this? And Apple says mumble mumble Tuesday mumble, essentially,
Yeah.
right? Like this is again what happens if you don't, like, I know that not everybody buys a new whatever from Apple every year. That's not how buying cycles work, but you have to motivate a segment of your audience to upgrade by releasing a new product that makes them go, oh, right? Like, and catches their eye. And when you don't, this happens. When you don't release a new iPad for more than a year, iPad sales go down because one of the best marketing things you can do for any product is release a new one and say, hey, we got a new thing.
Well,
Please consider it.
You also create pent up demand, right? Because people are like, oh, I shouldn't upgrade. I should hold off. I shouldn't buy a new iPad because it's been like a year. There's probably new iPads coming. And people will keep doing that for a long time.
For a very long time. Although, as this was pointed out by Mike in the YouTube comments, and I'll switch back to this slide. It is important to say, yes, with no new iPads for 5 quarters, they still sold $5.5 billion worth of iPads, lest we forget, which is kind of amazing.
No, it's very. I mean, people will always buy new iPads because a lot of people aren't. They just need a new one. They buy a new one. I think like you said, the iPad replacement cycle is more like the Macs. So you see people hold on to them longer. People don't buy them as often. I mean, the history of the iPad, as you can see from that chart right there, it's ups and downs, man. It's ups and downs.
It's definitely had its ups and downs. Okay, the iPhone. We can get to the excuses if you like. The 46 billion in revenue, which is not bad actually if you think about it. It is down from the year-over-year second quarter though. They say it's a tough compare.
So the rationale here is if you cast your mind back to a year ago, they were taking credit for a record quarter of iPhone sales because they had that glitch with, was it the iPhone 14 Pros, I think, where they had to shut down that factory for a little while.
Right.
And there was some demand problem. Like there was more demand and they couldn't make them fast enough. And so those sales got moved into the Q2 last year. And so they're saying, like, again, the very convenient part of this is me is like, well, if you look at it, it was 5 billion extra. And if you take that out, it's flat. How convenient that it was exactly the amount to take out and then it was flat afterwards.
Yeah. But if you put those 2 quarters together, by the way, it's still 2 billion in revenue down from if you sum Q1 and Q2 in successive years, it's still down.
Sure,
it's still down, but they say there's like a tough compare because you're comparing apples to oranges a little bit because some of Q1 shifted, the holiday quarter shifted into Q2 because of late shipments, and therefore don't blame poor old Q2. But they didn't say no, we didn't do well last quarter because it was a fair compare. They just say we did great.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yes. And they didn't go looking back at like their transcript from a year ago in the quarter. They mentioned the fact that we had some offset and like stuff was fulfilled in that quarter, but they weren't being like, well, it's a record number of iPhone sales, but we got to remember we got some extra sales this time. So, it's kind of a soft record. No, they don't say that. Yeah. They just say it's a record. Yay. Everything's great.
Yeah. But now, and this is an interesting point. Unlike the Mac, which sort of, it had its hump there for COVID and Apple Silicon and sort of coming down the other side. The iPhone is interesting because as freaked out as people sometimes are about a lack of iPhone growth, what this chart, if you look at that rolling 4-quarter average especially, which is the black line, or if you look at, for example, the 2020 Q2, which one
Hmm.
of our listeners, Mike, also said this. If you look at quarter two of 2022 versus which was 29 billion, and now it's 46 billion. Or
Yeah.
you can just look at that black line. The black line is they had this huge growth that happened in 21 and they've held on to it. It's flat, yes, but what they didn't do is recede back to 20. And that's encouraging, right? They've set a new bar for what
Right.
an average iPhone quarter would look like.
This is, and again, I mean, I know we're only getting back to what Q2 20 or Q3 2019 here.
Yeah, in the
But this is the
rolling
thing we talk
thing.
about a lot with like, when the iPhone 6 came out and it like leveled up like because of there was demand, right? So if you
Yes,
can imagine that if you zoom out
the
far
super
enough back to,
cycle.
2010,
Hmm.
yeah, and look at that, you would see up, flat, up, flat, up, flat, right? Like, so I think we're
Yes.
in that period now. And the question is there more up to go? And I say, well, I don't bet
Oh man,
against it, but it's a few years.
that is always the question, right? Is there more up there or not?
How high can you
Because
go?
that is because it's hard, right? Like it's hard to do the. Let me see. I think I can get a. Oh, can I do it live? Can I
Oh.
grab an unanticipated
Live charts.
chart
Stand by, everybody. You're seeing this. Excuse
live?
me, we're breaking in. I've got a voice
This
in my
just
ear
in.
saying
This chart just in.
we've
Let
got
me
a
see if
chart.
I can bring it up here. This is not that exciting, but I'm gonna claim it is. Okay.
Ooh.
Here is your in 2015 it ticks up and then it sort of like slides a little bit but is just kind of there for a couple of years. 2018 ticks up a little slide.
Hmm.
2021 ticks up and goes up again in 22 a little bit and then a
Yeah.
little slide, but not a lot, and it's going to stay there,
Okay.
and that's
Yeah.
you're setting that bar higher. That's a really positive sign.
Yeah. I mean, the challenges are always how many more people can you sell iPhones to?
Yeah.
Right. Sooner or later,
So
everybody who wants one has one. But then there's the replacement cycle. So, you still get people replacing their old ones.
right. So there was
Yeah.
a question on the call that felt almost like a setup. It felt almost, I mean, it was such a good question that I was it a plant? I don't know, but it was funny, and it was after many questions about China, and it was my favorite part of the whole thing where Richard Kramer from Arete Research said, "I'm not going to ask about China," and you can hear Tim laugh in the background. And he basically said, "You always call out rapid growth in many other emerging markets. Is Apple approaching a point where all those other
Mm.
emerging markets might cross over to become larger than your current 70 billion Greater China segment?" And maybe investors could look at that for driving growth in the wider business. And Luca Maestri jumps on and he's like, "I think you're asking a really interesting question. We were looking at something similar recently." But, this is where they basically say that where the growth comes from at this point is they're looking at India, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia. The numbers are getting large, and we're very happy because these are markets where our market share is low. The
Hmm.
populations are large and growing, and our products are making a lot of progress. The level of excitement for the brand is very high, and there's this idea that Apple is, in many ways, an aspirational brand globally, and that there are lots of markets where it is just for the function of the economy of that market and the cost of Apple products has not been a realistic thing, and that potentially it is now. So that's
Yeah.
part of the
And
story is where do you find new iPhone buyers? And the answer is Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, India.
right. And they've been talking also about like expanding the retail footprint into other places. I know in Tim's recent trip through Southeast Asia, went to a bunch of places like I feel like Malaysia, and there was some talk about Vietnam too. I think there because Vietnam now has an online store for the first time. So yeah, obviously if you can go into a market where not a lot of people have been able to buy your product before because you don't have good channels or you don't have your own retail presence, all that stuff, there's a lot of open fields for you to take advantage of there, especially if you have countries like that with large populations and, like China did, growing middle classes, people who want to buy into that status symbol. So there's, I mean, there's billions of people in the world. There's still room to sell iPhones. But yeah, that question was also really interesting because it also starts to takes the pressure off China as a consumer market in some ways, if they start talking about like, well, but these other markets together are bigger, maybe we could, package those together and talk about those as a region as opposed to breaking out China. And meanwhile, they're also, diversifying their manufacturing away from China.
Right.
So all of that is a way to sort of decrease the emphasis on China, and especially because they've not saturated China,
Right.
but they've done well.
Also, Apple's claim right now today is that they push back a little bit on the idea that people are obsessed with Apple and the iPhone in particular in China. He said he had research that said that in urban China they have the number one phone, that they saw iPhone sales acceleration this quarter. And the moment that I really was amused by, and this is Brent says they didn't address or were asked about China market shrinkage. They were asked numerous times about it, and basically it led to a moment that, as somebody who used to work for IDG, which also owns an analyst firm, IDC, that often made predictions that those of us who worked at IDG thought were ridiculous. I thought this was really funny, where Aaron Rakers from Wells Fargo asked what was the third question about China in a row, and said, when we look at the data points that have been repeatedly reported throughout the course of this quarter, what are we missing? Because Apple said, no, we're accelerating. What are we missing? And Tim Cook's response was, I can't address your data points. I can only address what our results are. And we accelerated last quarter. And iPhone grew in mainland China. So that's what the results were. I can't bridge, whatever that is, to numbers we didn't come up with. And that is, I'm just going to say it, that is shade being thrown. That is Tim Cook saying, yeah, a lot of people report a lot of things about iPhone sales in China. Legally, we can't make up numbers, so you be the judge, right? That's Aaron, essentially what he's saying. Is that Aaron, there are lots of ideas out there where you see, and let this to be, look, Apple is going to spin things in their most positive way possible, but I'm just going to say, when you see guesses about shipments from an analyst somewhere that is based on, first off, ask yourself, based on what? Did they make it up? Are they making a guess? Whatever. What's their source?
With their clipboard?
Be real skeptical, because I can tell you, I've seen it time and again. A lot of those analyst projections are just wrong. They're I don't know if they're made up, but they're coming from data that is deeply questionable.
Yeah. They're making models that are basically based on entirely past information. They have curves and stuff they try to fit stuff to, but those are their models, and models are imperfect. But I did enjoy this moment as well, because it's a classic. This is Tim. You burnt.
Yeah, really. That was really good. So anyway, it's surprising, right? Because he could have been yeah, it was a tough one, and he's like, nope. It was not. Anyway, so 10% down year over year, but extenuating circumstances, tough to compare, et cetera, et cetera. Services, though, everybody wanted to talk a lot about services. Services set a record, $23.9 billion. You can see the numbers just pretty much just go up. And I'll point out again that services gross margin was 74.6%, which I believe is a record. It was certainly up 180 basis points from last quarter. A 75% profit margin on services is the balm that cures a lot of financial ills.
Boy, I mean, I kind of missed the breakdowns of segments. They didn't talk as much about services various, or if they did, I missed it, but I didn't. A lot of times they talk about driven by App Store and iCloud and whatever, and I felt like they did not as much talk about that this time around.
No.
And so I'm curious to know what's driving that number. I mean, it's typically App Store has historically driven a lot of it, right?
App Store, Google search deal.
Google search deal, yep. Which there was a report today of something about $20 billion they spent on that last year or something. So it's a lot.
And
but it is also those moments, right, where you sit over there and you go, you're 75% margin.
Yeah.
That's you're printing money.
Just to be clear, money. Apple's hardware, which is traditionally the one that we always think of as being the incredibly high profit margins of Apple hardware, was only 36.6%.
Yeah, it's usually about 35, and they're and that's expensive. You have to build hardware, right? Like you have
Yeah,
to
it's made
build
of
widgets.
atoms. You have to have
Yeah,
factories. You have to ship it places.
yeah, bits, man. Bits are free or
Ooh.
cheap at
Okay, so
least.
and then the to go with the service revenue, there's the year-over-year change, which they had the expansive growth that has kind of settled
Yeah,
down, but still you're
it's
looking at
very
settled
respectable.
down growth that's still double digits year-over-year for the last three
14%.
quarters.
Yeah, and so again, like I said, a bright spot and otherwise kind of meh quarter.
Yeah, and that takes us back to the margin number which I showed earlier. This is the gross margin, which
Yeah,
averages out between services and products to be 46.6%. But I mean,
this is
just keep in
bananas.
mind, keep in mind, Apple brings in $1 billion, and 466 million of it is profit.
Yeah, I remember. So when I was live doing transcribing these calls, when you and I were doing this for Macworld, and after, like, reliably their margin was 36 to 38%. And you can see that at the beginning of this chart. It is 37, 38, 38, 38, 38, and then all of a sudden, boom,
And that's
like
and that
up to
that
that's
goes with
huge. It's
the
services.
services growth.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
those go together. Yes, as Mike is just killing it today. Good job, listener Mike. Um, they did mention some places where services did set all-time revenue records, and he said they were in relatively smaller areas of the service business, but they were growing very fast. And he mentioned
Mm-hmm.
cloud,
Yeah.
video, payment
Payment
services.
service. Yeah.
Interesting.
Apple Pay. Yeah, I actually, and this is, it's ancillary to this because it didn't really get answered, but I thought it was very interesting that Tim was asked about the DMA Mark store, and he dodged those, saying, "Well, we just launched it. It's super early. We can't talk about it."
Too
But
soon to tell.
it's there's gonna come a point where I think somebody will ask them that question and they may have to answer it. We'll see. You can do a lot of dodging, but like sooner or later, it's gonna be a year or 2 years, and people will be like, "What do you see over there?" And like, we don't get a ton of insight into that. Like, we will get, interestingly, I think we may get good insight from the third party stores, folks like AltStore or whatever
Yeah.
reporting their numbers. But
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be interesting because if their services continue to grow because App Store continues to drive these things, they don't have as much of an argument about not being able to do this.
Yeah, I mean, no news, in fact, is bad news for them in a way, because if
Yeah.
they say it didn't have any effect on our business, like, well, then what are we even
Yeah.
doing here?
Well, yeah. What do you complain about?
Okay, wearable home and accessories, which, Vision Pro launched, but again, it ships in such small quantities that it's not going to make an impact. And this is one of those
Zoom in real
categories
far.
that zoomed up to a new height, but now is just sort of tailed off to be, again, it's not quite back where it was, but it had some inflationary period during, especially 20 and
Right.
21. You can
I mean,
look
I think
here.
AirPods have been
Here it
and
is.
Apple Watch are the drivers here, right?
Yeah, AirPods and Apple Watch for sure are the drivers here. So you can see had a really great run of huge growth and has now topped out. And so for the last 2 years, essentially, there have been a couple of positive quarters and a lot of them that are down quarters, and that's just a function of this business having its inflationary period and then kind of steady state or a little contraction after that. Not surprising, because in tech products, right? Apple talks a lot about their install base, and they said, again, record install base. That's the number of active devices. And so that's one way to think about this is, if you have a really good year and sell an enormous amount of a product, it's not that momentum doesn't lead to the same number being sold the following year. What it leads to is more users in the universe, in the install base, who go on a buying cycle. And so if you think about like the baby boom led to like the echo boom, there's kind of a product life cycle demographic going on here, that if Apple retains their customers, then this inflationary growth period that happened for wearables will come back around. It'll be smeared, right? It'll be spread out over time. But the idea is they sold so many wearables in 1920, 21 that they will
Mhm.
lead to more wearables purchases, but it's not in 21, 22. It's in like 24, 25, 26 when it's time for that next pair of AirPods or that next Apple Watch because presumably customer sat, et cetera, they're buying. So that's, I mean, that's the story Apple's sort of selling here is that there is a long game being played here too, which is the more people in the
Right.
ecosystem, they will then continue to buy over time.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, and they've talked about that for years on because I felt like, especially in the heyday of the Mac, that was a big measurement for them because they're talking about the whole ecosystem play. And the more people are in your ecosystem, the more likely they are to buy other things. Go back to the old halo effect, right? People love their iPhone. Maybe they'll buy a Mac. Maybe they'll buy some AirPods. Maybe they'll buy an Apple Watch.
Exactly. So also Vision Pro, basically the thing they talked about is excited about developers and excited about enterprise. That
They
there
talked
are,
about it a lot for
yeah,
a not reporting any details, obviously, of sales, but it
yeah.
was the quarter where it launched. So
So they
yeah,
they gave it some love of just we're enthusiastic about all the things that people are trying to do with it. It was not one of those that's changed everybody's life. It was more like, look, a bunch of Fortune 100 companies have bought this thing to experiment with it and figure out how it fits. And when somebody asked, like, Tim, is something emerged as like the one or two things that are the killer apps for this thing? He said, no. He said there's a lot. It's super varied. It's all over the place, and we'll keep watching it. Which honestly, that's what I would have expected. Is like
yeah.
it would have been interesting if something had emerged. If he was like, yes, actually, surgery is going to be a killer app for this, but he didn't. He's like, yeah, medical and also maintenance of jet engines, and like it's just all over the place, and that's
It's
not
interesting too
surprising.
because it's also pushed back on the consumer angle because we mainly the press narrative has mainly been about the consumer
Yeah,
angle, which and you've seen a lot of stories recently like, oh, my Vision Pro went back in the drawer after 2 weeks, or I'm only using it occasionally, or whatever. It's fine, but like they
yeah.
want to talk up the other end of this too, which is we think it's really interesting for business customers.
Yeah, this arc is it's a HoloLens-ish arc in the sense that it's an expensive product that's going to have some industry applications to begin with. I think there's a belief that Apple's going to stick with this and that they will find a consumer angle, but that like right now, if you're trying to sell units of the $3,500 headset, businesses that find business applications is going to be where you do
They've also got more money.
that. Because yeah, I mean yeah. And we're back to total. What else do I have? I've got my
Mm,
little colorful percentage rainbow chart just to show how Apple's business is composed over time, and you can see the size of that services chunk and the iPhone chunk, and then the things we think of as so core to Apple's business. They're very nice businesses, the Mac and the iPad, but a tiny drop in the bucket of the overall. I have some regional charts that I like to do, even not everybody cares about them, but I care, just to see that Apple still, I mean, America's revenue is really important for Apple. Like that is Apple's number one market by a long shot. But you can see EMEA, I put this in there, I changed it. It's not just Europe, right? It is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I think India is in EMEA as well. So India growth would be in there. It's not just the EU, right? Only a fraction of this is the EU region where Apple is being regulated right now. And then you can see China, and that is the relevance there is that your developing world is coming from EMEA and rest of Asia Pacific essentially. Um,
yeah.
but you can see the size of the China
It will be
market
interesting
still.
if they ever decide to redefine these categories, but the challenge, as we know, is then you lose data
Yeah.
because,
I'll,
well,
I'll,
that
I'll
said, I'm sure they have
oh
it all
man,
broken out
I'm sure they do.
granularly.
I'm sure they do, and they don't want to share it because these are
Yeah,
like, why is Japan on here broken out? And the answer is Mac sales were big in Japan,
yeah,
and they broke out Japan in the 90s when they started
yeah.
doing these reports, the geo reports that, and Apple had a lot of Mac sales and a very strong Mac business in Japan, and so Japan got broken out, and it just stays there. And is that
China, same
relevant?
thing,
Is
right?
Japan a relevant? I mean, Japan's a nice market. I mean, look, Japan is a really nice market for Apple. It's probably one of their top five. But like, why is it broken out? And the answer is history.
Yeah.
History is why. And because Apple doesn't need the world to know more about its business than it's legally bound to share. So it's just going to leave it the way it is and make us guess. But they do. Big in Japan. That was a reference. And then here's the year-over-year growth for these key areas, and you can see that Apple actually had a little bump last quarter in Europe. America's sort of flat, and China, up and down after that huge growth. Again, huge growth expansion across all regions, but especially in China in 21. And finally, I have one more China thing because they love the China questions. I have one more chart, which is just monitoring that year-over-year revenue change in China. And down, but not, tremendously slow. So, and they will
down
say
less
some of that
quarter.
is about details of money, and some of it is about, the way they talked. I suspect that Apple has struggled in rural China and has struggled in Taiwan, which is part of Greater China. And they said, well, Greater China was this, but in urban China, it's this. And it's like, I don't know if Taiwan is urban China or if it's just Greater China. I don't know what's going on there, or if it's just in the hinterlands that Apple is not as popular, but in the sophisticated cities, it's doing fine. But that's the China chart. That's my last chart,
right? Yeah.
I had a bonus chart that I shared, but I still have come to the end of my charts, Dan.
It's the end of the charts, the end of a chart era.
As we know it. And I feel fine.
Well, that's our financials.
That's it.
That's it.
3
months from here, we'll be back.
We did it. I hope you found it illuminating at least a little bit. I mean, I did have that moment when I was listening. So I was watching NBC before the results came out, and one of the people they had on was Amit Daryanani from Evercore, who is on the call. And I had a moment, and I've said this before, like every now and then, I think I'm going to walk on the street and I'm suddenly going to be like, oh my God, it's Krish Sankar, or, it's a person who is not famous, but is always on the analyst call. And so I'm transcribing their comments. And
I write down every word you say.
It was, yeah.
You say creepily
yeah.
to
I mean,
them.
that's, if I met Luca Maestri, I would have a moment where I'd be like, Luca, I'm sorry to get so excited because I know you're just the CFO, but I do the charts and the transcripts. And he'd probably say, oh, you're one of those. But anyway, it would be.
Jason, I love your charts.
Yeah, but I enjoyed. Yes, I love it almost as much as Serie A, the soccer, which Eddie Q told me he specifically is a fan of. Yeah, so it is. Watching it closely, I hope we pick up details that are not the usual, and then we shared some of those with you. And trying to do this. We're not financial journalists; we're technology journalists. But as Apple specialists, we try to pay attention to the bigger picture of how Apple is running its business and where it's facing headwinds, to use the metaphor that we cart out every 3 months when this happens. But it's people are always looking for new growth for Apple. It's a challenge because Apple's gotten so big and grown so much that finding more places to grow, as you said, Dan, more markets to grow in is a constant challenge for them. New categories to go in. Why did they spend $10 billion on a car that they aren't going to ship? It's because they're trying to find new markets. They're trying to find growth areas, and those bets don't always pay off. But it is a company, like, there are still people out there, I think, who have a hard time thinking of Apple as anything but beleaguered or something. And It's like, they make so much money. They're so powerful.
It's
like,
just ridiculous.
It is. Yeah. If it weren't for the, market pressure of growth, you could almost say that Apple's only challenge is the challenge it gives itself. But the fact is, its challenges are growth and regulation. And I say a lot on podcasts that the big tech companies are so big that the only, we talk about this in terms of regulation, the only real
entities large enough,
are nation states, right? Or economic regions in the case of the EU. And then that's about it. But there's truth in that. And so it's an interesting dynamic that those end up being the places where they will face, like, what are the big headwinds for Apple? It's like the dollar, the European Union,
economic effects,
the various sort of nationalist tech policies of China, larger global Chinese Western relations. Like, Apple's challenges are a lot less about if they can buy more SSD memory and more about the world at large. And it's just so weird that that's where they are, but that's where they are. That's Apple now. All right. Although I'm not going to agree with Brent, who says Apple is unreal, really. It's like, are birds real? Yes, they are. Apple is real. It's a real company. You can really buy their products. We swear. We swear. And the earth is round also. Okay, that wraps up our adventure in charts for this quarter. We'll be don't be sad. We'll be back. There are more charts
I'm
to be made.
plus iPads
And
coming
Tuesday
soon.
things are
So
happening. So,
yeah.
yes, please check out sixcolors.com for all of that. And then we'll be back with more charts next time. But that brings us to the end of this Chart-a-Palooza. Bye, Dan.
Bye, Jason.
Bye, everybody.